Okay, thank you. And first of all, I feel a bit odd addressing a group of distinguished leaders like yourselves on the topic of entrepreneurship in an entrepreneurship community when you know as much or more in many cases than I might. But what I'd like to do is share with you some of the things that we're thinking about in Singapore and why we think it matters, why we think it's relevant to some of the areas that we hope that you're interested in as well. And what I'd like to do is achieve two things this morning. I'd like to share with you some of the work we're doing, and I'd like to see if we can build some bridges. The whole scenario for us is, how can Singapore be more globally connected in the areas of innovation and entrepreneurship, especially building in the areas of deep tech, because we're focused on trying to build globally relevant products, and I'd like to talk about what that means for entrepreneurs and investors. So, let me start a little bit with some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Here's Singapore, and the whole foundation for what I'm going to be sharing with you is that Singapore was built by innovation. We ourselves have had to think about solving important problems, and we've had to think about what this means for us, not only in the last several decades, but what does it mean in the decades ahead. What I'd like to do is just take a moment, because surprisingly, not everybody, it feels surprising to me, I've lived in Singapore 17 years, permanent resident there, and the Singapore government allows me to work for them. But at the end of the day, a lot of people may not remember where Singapore is. When I call sometimes, especially to a US company, and ask for something to be shipped, and I say, send it to Singapore, and then they say, and what country is that in? So I'm trying to always come back and say, here's where we are. So this is Singapore on the world map. As we zoom it in a little bit, just to refresh everyone's memory, this is where we are. Right? So we use this expression a little bit by the former president of Indonesia that referred to Singapore as a little red dot, and that's become a badge of honor. But I'll also talk in a few minutes about why I think that's part of our challenge. Sometimes some of our challenge is defining ourselves as a little red dot. So we were a startup. Singapore had to think about solving problems, had to think about product market fit. Where was its place in the world? Of course, trading and shipping, but what else? And how does Singapore continue to reinvent and continuously pivot? So looking for that product market fit, funding, economic structure, who were its customers? Are its customers in Southeast Asia or around the world? Who are the competitors? As China continues to build its one belt, one road infrastructure so that you can send things by rail from China to the UK, how do we think about our own place in the world? So we spend a lot of time thinking about Singapore as a startup. But at the same time, Singapore has evolved and is now also a big company. So we try not to break things. We try and make sure that we perform well and that we're doing the things that we promised to do. So the same things that made Singapore great as a startup also become more difficult as we mature. So this is some of our own challenge, just like it would be for any company. Here's some of the things that we worked on before. We had to think about housing and water and safety. So these big areas for Singapore we had to continuously think about. And we had to think about the fact that there's no fresh water on the island. It's purified from desalination or recycling or imported from neighbors, which is a security risk. How do we think about housing? How do we think about the fact that there was people until the early 1960s with many of the population having no running water, no sanitation? The healthcare and the education implications were not trivial. So these are things that Singapore had to work to solve. Now we think about some of the future challenges. We have the same challenges as any developing market or fully developed market around the world. It doesn't really make a difference whether you're in Southeast Asia or you're in Europe or North America. An aging population brings a different healthcare challenge. And just like it is in the United States, the Singapore population grows older, and there is now more people above the age of 65 around the world than under the age of 5. So in the next decade or so, that balance will shift, potentially forever, where there's more people over 65 than under 5. The first thing that used to afflict people would normally kill them. Now there's people that live for decades with chronic conditions and multiple issues of health. How do we care for those people? In a densely populated environment, we have to think about moving people around. Singapore has roughly 8,000 people per square kilometer. There is nowhere else to go. So when we think about transportation and housing and public safety, we have to plan in a densely populated environment. And resource, we don't want to build more power generation plants. How can we use energy more efficiently? So these are non-trivial problems, but the good news for us is they're also big market problems, which means if we can solve them, we have things that are relevant around the world. And that's one of our key themes. Now, I like to put this up because Singapore is very proud of where it ranks in a lot of things. It's a badge of honor. So in no particular order, if you want to think about where 15-year-olds are testing for maths and sciences, Singapore is normally at the top of that list. Now, there's all kinds of different benchmarks. There's things around, are we digitally ready? Are we more well-connected? Do we have lots of innovation inputs? So we are very, very highly ranked in innovation input, which means lots of resources going in to R&D. We rank less well, much less well, on output. So we're struggling with some of the conversion from a great IP environment to what does it mean in the market. That's part of what we're trying to address. So we have all of these things in our favor, and many more. But the question right now for us isn't so much, do we have all of these great rankings? The question is, so what? What do we do with that? What do we do with all of these things that are capabilities and talents? How do we continuously think about what we can do with these assets? So we're challenging ourselves, what can we do? And we like that word do. What can we do with something? Not what can we plan, what can we brainstorm, but what can we do? And that's part of what we're really focusing on right now. We ask ourselves the question, why can't we solve big problems? Famously, the footprint, there's an article out of MIT's Technology Review that says, why can't we solve big problems? Some of you may have read it by a guy named Jason Ponton. And we like the challenge statement, which is people used to work on big things and solve big problems. Now there's a lot of incremental improvement, which isn't a bad thing, but we don't want it to replace aspiration and ambition. So we're trying to be better. And I say we a lot through this because having lived in Singapore a long time, that's what I consider to be a home. Is it because we don't have enough of these things? We went back and said, is it a funding issue? Is it an education issue? Is it a government regulatory environment? Is it any of these things that we could change? And what we decided was it's not things that we need to try and look at. It's frankly that we just need to be more brave, more bold, more courageous. And the challenge for us is in an environment where things work well, most of the time, it's hard to then say, let's do something quite different. So if the underground system does not break down, then it's hard to say, let's try a radically new transportation infrastructure. Or if people are cared for well, security is good, transportation environment with airlines and freight. So the answer is there's really not that many things that drive us to think about improvement. And so that's the same analogy for a big corporation. Looking for things to improve all the time by a little bit versus the things that built that company in the first place. Some of that risk. So for us, it boils down to a simple thing. Simple, but difficult. Our number one challenge right now, and the area that we're trying to work on and would like to work on with like-minded people, is mindset. How can we be better at saying, we don't know where this leads, but we think it's an important thing to work on. We think that the outcomes could be great. So we often say to people, what would this be like? And sometimes people on the other side of the table will say, well, what if it doesn't work? And that's a good thing to ask, and it's a good thing to plan around, but we often say, but what if it does work? So what if it doesn't work if an AV or an autonomous vehicle is on the road? And the answer is, how do we think about insurance? How do we think about safety? All good things. But how do we also think about what if it does work? We need it to work because we know that the current model can't go on forever. So one of the big innovations for automobiles, in 1948, there was a padded dashboard because people kept cracking their head on the dashboard. And so the answer is put some padding in. That's an innovation. And it came from what? It came from real life experiences. Same thing with a seatbelt, airbag, anti-lock brakes. So when people say, let's not put AVs on the road until we've worked out all the bugs and all the kinks, it's not going to happen. So part of what we try and promote is, let's try these things. Yes, we have to be sensible, but we cannot wait for something to be made perfect. Perfection is pursued through evolution, through experimentation, through prototyping. So this for us is the mindset challenge that we're trying to work on. Now, I use this, if anybody in the room remembers like Monty Python, these little guys to me remind the sort of Monty Python character, but our message here is simple. We think that there's two types of people that we're trying to be working with. An entrepreneurial crew, which is what my friend Mohanty here from MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, represents, an entrepreneurial crew that helps entrepreneurs do what they do. And that's part of what I represent as well, an entrepreneurial crew, and the entrepreneurs. No entrepreneur scales the peak without a lot of people that are involved, whether it's funding, regulatory environment, something with resources, whatever the case might be. So our job is to try and be a good entrepreneurial support crew. And we're trying to enable, not so much help or support, because those sound sort of debilitating words, but enable the entrepreneur to continue to scale up. That's what we're trying to create in Singapore. And we're trying to do that at a national level. So for us, this entrepreneurship journey is not about one person or one company or one industry. It's around how do we make the entire Singapore economy more entrepreneurially minded. Here's our Deputy Prime Minister. His words, I think, said it well. We want to try and think of this as an entrepreneurial environment, SG Innovate. And the reason that's important is that we are not a government agency. We are a private limited company that we set up. We are owned by the Singapore government. So our share, our equity base is owned by the Singapore government. But we are a private limited company for the purpose of trying to be nimble and active and entrepreneurial. So for the Deputy Prime Minister to make that statement of, I would like to see SG Innovate experiment and pivot, had some jaws dropping in other parts of the economy that said, wait a minute, these guys are associated with government, how can these words fit? And that's part of our goal, is to make sure that we send the message that we want to be experimental, that government wants to be experimental. Here's what we do. So part of my message this morning is, if there's people in the room that think that what we do is consistent with the things that you like to do, then there's an opportunity for us to find something to do together. So our goal is enabling ambitious and capable men and women. And I say ambitious and capable because you can be ambitious and not capable, or you can be capable and not have any ambition. If you have those two and you think you can build something that's globally relevant, that would be great. Our goal is not to build something for Singapore. Our goal is to build from Singapore, with Singapore, but it's not to build for Singapore, because we get it, that market itself is not sufficiently large on its own. It's not our ambition to build a local product. It is our ambition to build something globally relevant. We say technology intensive because we're not trying to clone or recreate things. We're trying to break some ground. Most of the people with whom we work are building on their PhD research that they would like to take further. So we are good at working with people that have worked on new things, but are not necessarily sure how to build it into a business, a product. So we're good at the things that have to do with funding and customers and regulatory environments and challenges. And what we do is try and find and curate people that want to bring that front end, that science and that tech. So we know what we're good at, and we're honest about the things that we're less good at. And like anybody, we try and fill those gaps. So our goal is to try and help people achieve that mission. Now, here's how we do it. Nothing on there that you wouldn't already know, but for us to have these capabilities in one shop, what we try and do is make sure that we can invest when other people may not. Our goal is to write the first check so that those people that the investor community may not know enough about, computer vision, machine learning, something to do with virtual reality, you can pick whatever the topic is. We have a different type of ecosystem at the moment in Singapore where people are ready to write checks for more internet-based properties. We have fewer people wanting to write checks for things that involve production or things that have a longer tail. We want to be involved in that and give those entrepreneurs some time, so we tend to be an investor at that moment. We don't give grants. We're not a free money organization. We're an organization that buys equity of the company because we believe in the commercial future. We try and help with talent. It's a global challenge, making sure that great people know each other. We try and help with customers, calling in people that we know, the same things that you would be doing. And we try and make sure that wherever we can, we're taking bumps out of the road so that the entrepreneur continues on his or her journey. Okay, here's the team with whom I work. We have a number of young men and women. Our goal is to make sure that we're doing things that make a difference for Singapore and for markets around the world. So my number one message for this morning, Singapore as an entire country was a startup. We're now a big company where getting things wrong is not desirable. We want to make sure things work and things work smoothly. And that's also a constraint. So when I talked a little bit about the little red dot, that's sometimes a mental burden for us because some of the people with whom I work in Singapore are not able to say, let's do something that impacts the world. So our challenge as a government, as SG Innovate, as a group of men and women, is when we find someone to say, don't worry about whatever that limitation is, don't think about it as the market, think about it as a national priority, an economic priority, an ambition, a vision. So for us right now, mindset is our biggest challenge. Not money, not education, not IP, not corporations, but the idea that we can and we should and we must do something that makes a difference for people around the world. That's the entrepreneurial journey that we're on. We're trying to recreate and recapture that spark from some time back in Singapore's journey. And we'd like to see if there's people in the room that would like to work on that together with us. So what I'd like to do is not go further in terms of adding more slides, but instead to take the risk of just stopping and saying, I always like to learn from people that are in the room, and I like to answer questions if there's things that I can answer so that you feel fully informed as best I can make that happen about what we're doing in Singapore. So it's always deadly to stand on a stage and say, does anybody have any questions, in case it's stone silence, but I'm going to take the risk and I'm going to say thank you for that if you'd like to stay in touch. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, I'm going to do my best to answer them.
Thank you. I'm a long-time entrepreneur, 40 years, and the one thing for sure is I'm leaving California. In 2015, I paid 61% of my income with the new 13.3. So the point is, Singapore happened to be one of 3 countries I'm looking at. As a U.S. citizen, how hard would it be for me to live in Singapore for the rest of my life?
I'll let you know because I'm on that journey. But I mean, the only downside, as you know, for about taxation is I'm a U.S. citizen. I've lived in Singapore 17 years. I pay 20% in Singapore, and I send the rest to the U.S. government once a year.
I don't mind U.S. taxes, but I do mind 13.3% California, no long-term capital gains.
So there's lots of different opportunities. There's a group of people. The best thing about Singapore is because it's so international, there are nationalities of all sizes and stripes. And so Singapore tries to make it easy for people that are ready to add economic value. We, like any country, are asking people if they're there, are they doing something that moves the whole agenda forward? But if that's something that you'd like to pursue, there's a lot of people that help make that possible.
Would you have any thoughts on what would it take for a brand new or very early stage startup which is involved in hardware oriented but going for computer vision based mechanisms, right? But very early on, right, what would be your suggestion if they want to get involved in SG Innovate and learn from them and get funding as well? Would that a possibility? And if that is so, what is your suggestion on how to go about it?
So one of the things that I try and do is, I shouldn't say me, my team and I try and do is put people together that have affinity. So we have a Chinese mainland scientist that's working in one of the universities in Singapore that's doing some interesting work on computer vision. We have 2 startups in our own team that we're invested in that are doing work on computer vision. And part of what we try and do is bring people that might have a 1 + 1 = something. So instead of investing in lots of things, part of what we're also trying to do is just make sure that people that might have some interesting joint development potential get to know each other. And they might pursue it or they might not. It's fine either way. So the answer is, if anybody wants to drop me a note, I'm at steve@sginnovate.com. So it's pretty straightforward. What I can do is discuss the specifics offline.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, it's a little hard to see with the lights, so.
Question. To engage with SG Innovate, the company has to be incorporated and headquartered in Singapore, or you can be incorporated here and then have a subsidiary or another structure out there.
We're interested in things that move Singapore and big problems forward. So we've invested in companies in San Francisco. We've invested in companies in the UK. But at the end of the day, our prime objective is to build on Singapore-based assets as opposed to sort of spray money.
So the research and technology development can happen in Singapore, but the company itself can be a Bay Area company. Okay.
Yeah. We just have to have a philosophical belief that something that we're doing is useful beyond just the check writing.
All right. Thank you.
I'll take one more because I think I'm going to get Kumar. Am I okay for one more? Okay.
How would you compare the cost of doing business in Singapore as an index of a low-cost area in the U.S., definitely not in the Bay Area? Let's say a university town in the middle of America where good talent pool is available, cost of living not too high, and all that.
So as much as we're highly ranked in a lot of areas, we're also highly ranked in being not cheap. So Singapore is an expensive place, but it's not that everybody is in Singapore. A lot of companies have set up a model where they have some of the work in Singapore and then leveraging some of the other countries, whether it's Malaysia, India, Cambodia. Some people are looking at Myanmar. So from that perspective, the IP protection, the transparency, the non-corruption, all the things that make Singapore a great place are also things that then make it not inexpensive. So I'd say it's more of a hub and spoke type of model versus concentration. So what I'd like to do is say thank you for the time. If you have something that we can follow up on to work on something exciting and big and impactful, please let me know. Thank you.